the most lawless town in the American West. The true story of Bodie, California, and the 2-year-old who almost burned it to the ground. There's a place high in the eastern Sierra Nevada, 8,375 feet above sea level, on a treeless, windswept plateau, where the snow piles 10 feet deep in winter and the summer sun bleaches the wood of every building to the color of bone, where roughly 100 weathered structures still stand exactly as they were left, leaning at angles the wind has imposed on them, doors hanging open onto rooms full of dust, schoolbooks still on the desks, bottles still on the saloon shelves, coffee cups still on the kitchen tables. It is called Bodie. Once, briefly, it was the wildest and most dangerous town in the American West. Then, a child almost erased it. The story begins in the summer of 1859, when 4 prospectors from the East Coast made their way into the foothills above Mono Lake, looking for gold. The most ambitious of them was a former New Yorker named W.S. Bodey. The W probably stood for Wakeman, though no one is entirely sure. Bodey and his small party found color in a stream bed in the high country, and the men staked their claim. It was the beginning of one of the largest gold strikes in California history, but Bodey himself never saw any of what came next. In November of that same year, only a few months after the discovery, he set out on a routine supply trip down the mountain to the small town of Monoville. A blizzard caught him in the open. He froze to death in the snow before he could return. He was buried, the rough story goes, near where he fell. He never saw the camp that bore his name. He never saw the Boomtown it became. He never even saw his own name spelled correctly on a sign, because as the legend has it, a sign painter who never knew him misspelled Bodie as Bodie on the first wooden marker, and the town simply accepted the new spelling and never changed it back. The man whose discovery built one of the largest gold towns in the American West died unknown, was misnamed, and lay forgotten in an unmarked grave somewhere above 8,000 feet. For 16 years, almost nothing happened. The discovery had been made, but the gold near the surface ran out quickly, and the rough little mining camp at Bodie languished. In 1876, the settlement had only a few dozen residents, a handful of stubborn miners working leaner and leaner veins, shipping the occasional load of ore down the mountain, and hoping. Then everything changed. Late in 1875, a mine shaft collapsed at a nearby claim called the Bunker Hill Mine, and the cave-in exposed a body of rich gold ore that nobody had known was there. The new strike was reorganized as the Standard Mine, and within 2 years it had produced gold worth millions of dollars in 1870s money. Word spread, and Bodie went from a few dozen residents to nearly 10,000 in the space of 3 years. By 1879, Bodie was one of the largest towns in California's interior, packed with around 10,000 residents in a place that had held only a few dozen 3 years earlier and outpacing nearly every other gold camp in the state. It had 2 banks, it had several daily newspapers, it had a Wells Fargo office, a narrow-gauge railway that hauled wood from Mono Mills, a brewery, a Chinatown, a red light district, a brass band, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 65 saloons. The main street stretched a full mile long, lined with 2-story wooden buildings that went up faster than carpenters could nail them down. The air smelled of cordwood smoke and whiskey and unwashed bodies and the chemicals from the stamp mills crushing rock around the clock at the edge of town. It was also, by every measure, that anyone bothered to keep, the most violent place in the American West. Killings in Bodie were not rare events. They were daily events, sometimes more than once a day. The local newspapers stopped reporting them with the breathless drama of the early years and started running them in small columns near the back of the paper like weather reports. Stabbings, shootings, beatings, stage hold-ups, mining feuds, claim jumping, drunken brawls that ended in funerals. By the time Bodie was at its peak, more than 10,000 residents lived in a town where life expectancy for a young man could be measured in months. The reputation was so widely known that a phrase entered the wider American vocabulary. There is a story, almost certainly embellished, by a notoriously inventive frontier newspaperman named Jim Townsend, who ran the Bodie Minor Index in the 1890s and was famous for what was politely called imaginative reporting, that a little girl in San Jose, on learning that her family was moving to Bodie, wrote in her diary the words, "Goodbye God, I'm going to Bodie." Whether the girl actually existed or whether Townsend invented her, the phrase stuck. For the rest of the 19th century, and well into the 20th, "Goodbye God, I'm going to Bodie" became the way Americans referred to a place so wild that civilization itself seemed to have given up on it. The most famous of the local bad men was a half-mythical figure, simply called the Bad Man from Bodie, who appeared in dime novels and newspaper columns across the country as the platonic ideal of frontier menace. Bearded, armed, drunk, unbothered by consequences. He may have been a real person, or he may have been a composite of half a dozen real people, or he may have been entirely invented. In Bodie, the distinction between fact and legend was always thin. But the boom did not last. Booms never do. By 1880, the easy ore was already running out. The deeper shafts produced less and less. The newer mines that opened on the edges of town never matched the standard's yield. By 1881, the population was already falling to 7,000, then 5,000, then by the mid-1880s, 1,500. People left for newer strikes, for Tombstone, for Leadville, for the Klondike a decade later. The newspapers consolidated and then disappeared. The brass band stopped playing. The bigger saloons closed. The smaller ones held on. Then, in the summer of 1892, a kitchen fire broke out west of Main Street and spread quickly through the dried-out wooden buildings. Most of the western half of the town burned to the ground in a few hours. Some of it was rebuilt. Most of it was not. The miners and families who remained scraped together what they could and patched their houses with corrugated metal and salvaged lumber, and the town settled into a long, slow afterlife. Quieter every year, smaller every census, but still functioning. By 1910, around 700 people still lived in Bodie. By 1920, around 100. By 1930, fewer than that. And then came June 23, 1932. The fire that ended Bodie was started by a child. His name was Bodie Bill. He was 2.5 years old, the son of a local miner. The story, as it survived, was this. There had been a school party in town that afternoon, and Bill had been brought along. He had been promised ice cream. He had been served red Jell-O instead. Bill was, by all accounts, furious. He stormed out of the school, walked home through the dusty Bodie streets to a house his parents had left unlocked while they were at work, found a box of matches, and went looking for a place to use them. He chose a vacant building behind the Sawdust Corner Saloon. It was June, and the wood was dry, and there was no fire department left worth mentioning. The flames spread quickly to the surrounding buildings, then jumped the alley, then jumped Main Street, then jumped to the residential district. By the time the fire burned itself out the next day, more than 90% of what was left of Bodie was gone. The bank was gone. The hotels were gone. Most of the stores were gone. The newspaper office was gone. The Standard Mine survived, and a small fraction of the older homes survived, and the Methodist Church survived. But the heart of the old Boomtown had been turned in less than 24 hours into a field of ash and twisted nails and standing chimneys. Bodie Bill was, in time, sent to military school. His name passed into local folklore. His parents stayed in town for a while longer, and then they too left. What survived was a remnant. Around 100 buildings, 5 to 10% of the Boomtown that had once filled the valley, stood in a kind of stunned silence after 1932. The Standard Mine kept operating for a few more years, but the country had entered the Great Depression, and the price of gold could not justify the cost of pulling it out of an isolated mountain town that no longer had a town around it. In 1942, the Federal War Production Board, conserving resources for the Second World War, ordered all non-essential gold mining suspended across the United States. The Standard shut down. The last few families in Bodey packed their belongings and walked away. They left their kitchens half-stocked, their saloons mid-pour, their schoolrooms with books still open on the desks, because they could not carry everything and because they did not entirely believe they would not be back. They never came back. The wood weathered. The wind kept blowing. The snow kept coming. The buildings sagged. In 1962, the state of California acquired the site and designated it a state historic park, and that same year, the United States Department of the Interior declared it a National Historic Landmark. And then the state's preservation team did something almost unique in American historical preservation. They decided not to restore Bodey. They decided not to repaint it, not to rebuild it, not to make it look the way it had looked at its peak. They decided to keep it exactly the way they found it, to stabilize the structures so they would not fall down, but otherwise to leave the dust and the weathered wood and the broken windows and the gradually rotting interiors alone. They called this preservation philosophy arrested decay. Bodey would be allowed to keep on aging slowly into its own ghost story. It would not be a museum. It would be a memorial, the most honest one in California. Today, you can drive to Bodey on a single road that turns to dirt for the last few miles. There is no cell service. There is one ranger station. There are no shops. There are no restaurants. There are no restored facades or costumed interpreters or recreated saloons. There is only the wind and the silence and the wood that has been there for 150 years and the sense, sometimes overwhelming, that the people who lived in these buildings simply walked out one afternoon and never came back, and that the buildings themselves are waiting for them. There is also a story that the rangers will tell you if you ask. Visitors who have taken small objects from Bodey, a nail, a piece of porcelain, a chip of glass, sometimes mail them back, sometimes with notes. Sometimes the notes describe runs of bad luck so specific and so consistent that the senders had become convinced the town was angry with them. The rangers keep these mailed-back letters in a file. They call it the Bodie Curse. They make no claims about it. They simply note that the file is large and it keeps growing. So Bodey carries, at its 8,000-foot altitude in the eastern Sierra, almost everything you might want to know about the American West at the end of the 19th century. The miner who found it and never saw it. The boom that built it in 3 years. The lawlessness that defined it. The fires that burned it twice. The toddler who finished the job. The federal order that emptied it. The state agency that left it to weather. And the curious file of letters from people who took a piece of it and could not, in good conscience, keep it. Many people will never visit Bodey. Many people never knew any of this happened, but now you know. That's the story of Bodie, California, and we're just getting started. If this is your first time here at Lost California, welcome. Every week, we go deep on the towns, the disasters, the scandals, the forgotten stories, and the hidden history that made California what it is today. Subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and leave a comment below telling us which California city or town you want us to cover next. We read everyone. We'll see you there.